March the 19th, in 1949, stood a cinema called the Cameo cinema on this spot. A small suburban cinema, a converted Methodist chapel. The wonders of television had not yet arrived for ordinary people in the city of Liverpool. And therefore, by custom, people went to the cinema more frequently, usually their local cinema, not many people having cars. And on this particular night, the film was Bond Street, a gangster movie. And at 9:30, Mr. Leonard Thomas, aged 44, the manager, and John Bernard Cottrell, aged 30, were counting the takings in the office. The office was where the choir in the old chapel used to be. 9:30, the door bursts open, and in comes a man with a gun, demanding the takings. From the observation of the scene later, it was clear that the two men did not pass the money immediately over to the robber, but they processed it. And some sort of struggle may have taken place. But the robber fired 6 shots into the bodies, the manager and the assistant. Leonard Thomas died immediately, and John Bernard Cottrell 2 hours later. The assailant dashed down the stairs, and a number of people were later to describe the assailant's appearance. But they had only a fleeting glance. He was wearing a trilby, an overcoat, and it was said that he had a cloth around his lower part of his face, a la American gangster movies. Ran out of the cinema and headed down here, out into the distance. Nobody actually had a precise picture of him, or indeed nobody could catch him. He'd gone into the darkness. One of the staff rushed to the telephone and found the wires had been cut. Somebody ran across the road to one of the houses that was on the telephone, and the CID were informed of this dreadful, dreadful murder. The timing of that call was 9:45. Now, we're now in the Beehive Public House in the centre of Liverpool, very near the famous Adelphi Hotel. This public house becomes a very significant factor in the story as it unfolds. Inspector Barmer ordered a door-to-door inquiries to be made. Policemen, detectives were sent, asked questions around the neighbourhood. He had a different plan in mind. He called the next day to speak to George Kelly. George Kelly was staying at that time with his lady friend, Doris O'Malley. And he called and immediately established, and this that we can believe to be true, that he wasn't really inquiring about George Kelly. He didn't really believe George Kelly would be involved in a wicked shooting. But George Kelly was known to be useful historically in passing information on to Barmer and to the police. He was, in effect, an informer. And therefore, he checked the alibi of Kelly, but very easily, very quickly, was satisfied. Kelly didn't believe at that stage that he was under any suspicion at all. Indeed, perhaps he wasn't. 2 months afterwards, an anonymous letter was received, an illiterate sort of letter, in which the writer suggested that 2 people were involved in this murder and that information could be given, providing an immunity was given to the writer of the letter, i.e. King's evidence, and that an assurance would be given that that would be the case. Then information would be given to Inspector Balmer. In the letter it said, would you put in the personal ads of the Liverpool Echo an assurance that no action will be taken against me, the writer of this letter? A rather cavalier promise, not knowing the extent of the writer's involvement, but we'll leave that aside. No response came. It is known, of course, that the police receive many anonymous letters when there's a murder of this kind, which has received such publicity. Now we reach September of the year 1949. 2 people, Jacqueline Dixon and James Northern, were being investigated and questioned by Inspector Balmer, when astonishingly they then said they had positive information. And the information is such that if they were given an immunity against prosecution, they could deliver to Balmer the name of 2 people responsible for the murder. And the story they told was on the Saturday night in question, the night of the murder. Sitting over there was Northern, Dixon, George Kelly, and a man called Charles Connolly. The 4 of them were planning a robbery. And that, a crowded Saturday night in this public house, it is suggested that they were planning this robbery and that George Kelly produced and displayed to the other 3 a pistol and live bullets. Northern claimed to have nothing to do with it. Jacqueline Dixon said that she would have nothing to do with it. Who was Jacqueline Dixon and James Northern? Well, James Northern had recently been released from prison. He had a record of criminal behaviour. Jacqueline Dixon was a lady that earned a living on the streets and also had a record of dishonesty. I mention that because at this stage, the only 2 people that could give evidence against Kelly and Connolly, the 2 men mentioned as being in the beehive, were these 2 people with questionable records, and their veracity had to therefore be open to doubt. Connolly was arrested in the early hours of the morning and brought to the police station. Kelly was asked to call at the police station. He didn't have in his mind that he was vulnerable. He didn't really know why he was asked to call. but Barmer often consulted with Kelly on matters various on the criminal activities in Liverpool. When Kelly gets there, he finds that he's going to be charged with the murder of the two men in the cinema, and that Connolly was already at the police station. Now, from that moment, Kelly and Connolly were adamant, telling Barmer that they did not know each other, they did not even recognize each other, and they stuck to that statement from that moment to the very end of the trials. Now, we're now in a difficulty. There was no forensic evidence. Fingerprints were taken at the Cameo cinema. None of them showed Kelly's fingerprints. No forensic evidence. The gun was not discovered, despite extensive searches. And on the basis of these two people's statements, they were to face trial for their lives at St. George's Hall. Now this, of course, worried Inspector Barmer considerably. But what was the role? The role of the two men, according to Barmer, was that Kelly went in and did the shooting, and that Connolly was outside as the lookout man. Now at this stage, after all these years, the credibility of that story is open to the gravest of doubts. If Connolly was the lookout man outside, what was his role? Policeman comes down the road, was he to run in and say, George, there's a policeman coming? He certainly wouldn't have had a mobile phone in those days. So the role of a lookout man seemed in some way to try and implicate Connolly into this story, hoping that Connolly, to save his neck, would at some stage go along with the story and implicate and prove the guilt of George Kelly. Both men stood trial on the 12th of January in 1950, 10 months after the day of the murders. George Kelly, 27 years of age, was defended by Rose Halbrom, a young KC who was only 35, a star of the bar in the years to come. The 26-year-old Connolly was defended by Basil Neild, an experienced counsel, Member of Parliament for Chester. The trial lasted a week, and the jury were unable to reach a verdict. And Mr. Justice Oliver discharged the jury, both men to be retried. A decision was then made by the prosecution that both men should be tried separately. Kelly first and Connolly second, though alphabetically one would have assumed Connolly first. This is perhaps more significant than you would imagine. Kelly stands trial, same defence, virtually the same evidence, except a new name comes into the picture, a Robert Graham. Now, Robert Graham ingratiated himself with both Kelly and Connolly whilst they were on remand in Walton Prison. It was said that Kelly and Connolly couldn't communicate. Their cells were about 10 foot apart. Evidence has come since to show that was untrue. And therefore Connolly and Kelly were using, allegedly, Graham as a go-between, a man that could link one to the other. And in the exercise yard came the astonishing piece of information that Graham had received a confession from Kelly, that Kelly had admitted his guilt, and Connolly had admitted his role in the story. And therefore we now have, on the next trial of Kelly, just Jacqueline Dixon and Northern, whose credibility is open to doubt. And now we had the third person, Robert Graham, adding to the evidence against the defendant, Kelly. Now we must bear in mind that for the whole of the first trial, and indeed during Kelly's second trial, Kelly never admitted anything. Never admitted he knew Connolly, never admitted he was in the beehive. And likewise, that was the defense of Connolly. The jury, after a relatively short space of time, brought in a verdict of guilty, and Kelly was sentenced to death. Now, Charles Connolly was due to stand trial within days of Kelly's trial, with a new jury who would be aware of what happened in the Kelly trial. And added to Connolly's dismay, Basil Neilder, an eminent counsel, had decided that he could no longer continue to defend Connolly. He had parliamentary duties to do. And a new counsel called Edmund Rosen was brought in to defend Connolly. Within a day or two of coming to St. George's Hall for trial for his life for murder, he's visited by Edmund Rosen and solicitor, who was with him, to say the Crown, as the prosecution, are now prepared to accept a guilty plea of being an accessory in the sense that he was an accessory to robbery, that he was the lookout man, that Kelly was there, but he had no knowledge that Kelly had a gun and it was loaded. 1 week earlier, it was being maintained that Connolly did know, and if Connolly had been convicted in the first trial, would have certainly been hanged. There was an incredible change of foot in terms of Connolly. Now, Connolly said, as he'd always said, I had an alibi. It was true. My family supported where I was that night. As indeed, alibi for Kelly was also supported. How can I now suddenly say I've been telling lies and I'm least guilty of robbery? But Rosen was to say to him, I'm trying to save your life, man. You will certainly hang. And this enormous pressure was put on Connolly. And finally, on the day of his trial, he did plead guilty to robbery and receive 10 years imprisonment. Now, appeal for Kelly failed. Connolly, of course, had no grounds for appeal. He'd pleaded guilty to robbery. And the years rolled by. He completed his sentence. He tried to rebuild his life. And one day, he was talking to a Mr. Luigi Sant'Angeli, a retired businessman, man who I've known virtually all my life. A man of great integrity, and a man who would not easily be persuaded. But he investigated this case so thoroughly that finally this case for Kelly and Connolly went to the Criminal Case Review Commission. That's a filter system where they decide whether there's grounds for an appeal. It was successfully argued there. Luigi Sant'Angeli consulted a number of people to help, and finally a solicitor was instructed, and Mr. William Waldron appeared for Connolly in the Court of Appeal. Mr. William Waldron, distinguished counsel, held back his retirement for this task. And therefore, at the Court of Appeal, Because of Robert Graham's evidence not being given to the defence, in other words, the fact that Robert Graham gave evidence and that previously he'd nominated somebody else that was found to be false, then that was grounds sufficiently for Kelly's conviction to be quashed. They contested Connolly's conviction because of his guilty plea. And Mr. Walden argued very strongly that that confession, or the guilty plea, which amounts to confession, had been got under what was called duress of circumstance, oppression. If you confess to something virtually with a rope round your neck, it's hardly a free confession. And therefore, that on all the evidence before the Court of Appeal, they are prepared to quash the verdict against George Kelly and the verdict against Charles Connolly. Both men now have their reputations intact. Sadly, Kelly died at the hand of the hangman, and Charles Connolly died in 1997 and didn't live to hear his name cleared by the efforts of Bill Waldron, of Mr. William H. Waldron, QC, and Mr. Luigi St. Angeli, who did so much to get these men's name vindicated. Human life is precious. And when somebody's life is curtailed, an innocent victim is plunged into eternity, it should and does sorrow us all. There's no joy in murder, but there's a unique fascination because it belongs to the history of mankind. The people will kill others. However appalling it may be, it is part of the human condition. I am Vincent Burke. Thank you for joining me when we've explored the detail of mystery, murder, and all the human passions, part of the human condition, where sadly one person takes away the life of another.